Thanks, everyone. Welcome. For those that don't know me, I'm Dave Olson. I'm the chair of AmCham here in the Greater Toronto Area. And I hope that all is well for all of you, and everyone is obviously social distancing and sheltering in place. And some of us are growing our quarantine beards as well.
And that's exactly it. So I have also reached out.
It sounds like someone's not on mute. So if you're, you can just double check, make sure you're on mute. Okay, great, thanks. So just quick intro for those that don't know much about AmCham. AmCham Canada, we're the voice of US business here in Canada. We represent companies large and small, everyone from the Fortune 100 and down to small, much smaller companies with a real focus on helping cross-border trade and promote business in both directions. That's really our mission. And again, I would welcome everyone today, especially during the COVID-19 crisis. It's taught us a lot of lessons, obviously. First of all, we should certainly take a second to thank all of the healthcare workers and all the great work they've done. Also, thanks to all of you and the role that you're playing in sheltering in place and practicing social distancing and washing your hands. And then finally, we're thankful for the great work that some of our member companies are doing to help out during this time of crisis. Anyone from the healthcare industry to the pharmaceutical businesses, to those that build protective equipment, et cetera. AmCham, in the interest of delivering valuable programming for members and doing things in a way that makes sense today, we wanted to put this seminar together just to help keep everyone up to speed on things that are happening in a cross-border world that we live in, even though we're not crossing the border nearly as often as we did. So today we're really pleased to welcome Monique Smith from Global Public Affairs. Those that don't know Monique, she was the Ontario representative in Washington, DC under the Liberal government. She's a graduate of U of T, Queen's Law, and also served at McCarthy Tetro. And she's got an amazing and valuable insight to provide us on things that are happening south of the border, as well as here in Canada. So we welcome her, and then also we welcome Dan Utso. Dan leads the Canada-US practice at Dickinson Wright, and is the person who is probably closest day in, day out to the things that happen at the border and all of the Canada-US activities. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Monique and you can kind of run from there. Welcome and thank you.
Thanks, Dave. I'm delighted to be a part of this today and to be speaking to the members of AmCham and to be reunited, if only virtually, with Dan. We have crossed paths many, many times over the years during my stay in Washington. As you noted, Dave, I was Ontario's representative in Washington for 5 years, from 2013 to 2018. I was the first representative for Ontario. Alberta had a representative in the Canadian Embassy for a number of years, mostly dealing with energy issues. And so it was an interesting time for me to build up the office and the presence. I had a really interesting go during the kind of last years of the Obama administration, the first years of the Trudeau administration, and then of course the first years of the Trump administration, and particularly as we ramped up negotiations for the renewal of NAFTA, or the USMCA as it's now called. So prior to that, I was a member of the Ontario cabinet, and I held 3 different portfolios as well as being government house leader. So I brought a lot of my past experience to Washington, which was great. And now I'm settled in working a bit with Global Public Affairs and enjoying that and helping clients deal with Canada-US issues. So I wanted to do a quick overview of where we're at in this crisis. And then I know that Dan's got a few questions, and then I thought we would, we're hoping to get lots of questions down the side, if I can figure out how to do down the side. I know you guys explained that to me yesterday. And we will continue to to hopefully have a dialogue with all of you as you share your lunch hour in your various places at home. I'm sure some of you are hiding from your kids and the grilled cheese sandwiches, so we're happy to have you with us for this hopefully helpful time. So I wanted to look at three things: the state of play, kind of where we're at statistically, Canada in the world, Canada, US in the world. I wanted to talk a little bit about the opening of business, which is the big topic of discussion right now everywhere. And then I want to talk about the border impacts and how that's going to play out, particularly for cross-border entities. So starting with the state of play, I mean, we surpassed 2 million cases worldwide this morning. I'm sure most of you have got your morning hit of news and knew that. In Canada, we're looking at over 27,000 cases, with 1,900, just over 1,900 being hospitalized, and we've seen already 903 deaths. In Ontario, our cases are at 8,447. Quebec is at 14,000. US, looking at 609,000 cases with over 26,000 deaths. And just to give some context, US population 331 million, Canada population 37 million. US cases 609,000, Canada cases 27,000. And then if you kind of factor in Italy, which I think is kind of an interesting comparator given that they're ahead of us as far as this curve, 60 million people, 162,000 cases. So, and 21,000 deaths, a much higher death rate than either Canada or the US. So I think we can take from some of that we've learned from the experiences others ahead of us in this curve, and that we are certainly all doing our bit to plank the curve, as they keep saying, and trying to adjust to a new normal for Canadians and Americans. And I think, you know, there's been, again, this morning, the IMF is making predictions of a longer recovery than people were hoping for. A big hit to the GDP being reported all over in countries and in subnational jurisdictions. And I think people are looking to their governments for support. And we've seen rollout of various kinds of support and I'm just going to do a quick oversight in Canada, the US. I mean, there's all kinds of programs I mean, we could spend our days just trying to follow what's happening where. Certainly, one of the bigger programs in the US is the support for small business through its loan program. And we've seen a bit of a bumpy ride there for the loan program, with various banks looking at capping and only dealing with their own clients. And there's certainly some push for an extension and an expansion to that program in the US. In Canada, we've also seen support for small businesses, and that is being expanded. So there's certainly a push to expand the support for individuals, and that today it was announced is being expanded to more temporary workers. And that's just one kind of tranche, one kind of slice. We are also seeing another kind of issue right now. Canada, US is a start of criticism of the WHO. And the announcement yesterday by the president that he'll be withdrawing support, the US support for the WHO. In Canada, we're starting to see some political criticism of the WHO and of our national public health officials. And I think that is a bit of a troubling play on the international sphere, and I think could have longer term repercussions for sure as we deal with these kinds of crises in the future. Another kind of state of play, compare contrast, is the relationship of the governor and the president versus the premiers and the prime minister. And I think we're all seeing that play out in real time. And I think that is going to have an even stronger play as we see the rollout of opening up for business. So opening up for business, where are we at? You know, if I had a crystal ball, right? If everybody had a crystal ball, we'd be in a much better shape. But we're hearing the president on the one hand, again last night talking about opening in a staggered way, that he will be deeming certain states ready to open. He's now conceding that is actually up to the governors and the states to do that, make that decision. But he is saying that he will be monitoring that and that he will be clamping down hard on states if things start to go sideways. On this side of the border, you've got the Prime Minister in discussions with the premiers about how we look at that. He's certainly still talking about control and contain. He's talking about partial opening of the markets, and he's being quite cautious as he usually is. Although you are seeing some premiers like Premier Moe in Saskatchewan talking about wanting to get back to business sooner. You're seeing the Premier of Quebec talking about opening the construction industry sooner. So you're starting to see a little bit of flux in how we're responding. Although I think in Canada, we're still seeing a fairly united national approach, whereas in the States, we are seeing a growing battle between the governors and the premier, and we're seeing now the West Coast governors uniting to talk about the scientific approach to reopening. We're seeing East Coast governors gravitating together and doing a similar kind of discussion. And we're seeing, I think, a president who's being pressured by certainly the right wing of his party and of the economy, pushing for an earlier opening. And even last night was saying, he's looking at before April 30th as a date for partial reopening in certain states. And that would be probably, I think, seen to be against the advice of the health experts who are saying that things should stay status quo until the 30th. I think we're also seeing, the opportunity to watch other countries who are ahead of us in this curve and what they're doing. So we're seeing Denmark starting to reopen small businesses. We're seeing Austria also looking at the reopening and how they're approaching that, allowing small businesses to open first, and also monitoring very closely. We're seeing a discussion tomorrow of the G7 leaders and how I think that's, between the WHO support, I think the other big discussion will be how those countries are looking at the reopening and how we can learn from them. So I think we're heading to an area of interesting dynamic at the state and federal level on both sides of the border. And I think there's really an interest in talking about it because everyone wants to see the reopening of the economy as a reality in the not too distant future, right? It gives us all a bit of hope as we sit in our various confined spaces across the country and watch our retirement funds dwindling before our eyes. I try not to look at my account very often. I hope you don't either. So then we look at how that's going to be impacting the border. So I'm just going to quickly talk a little bit about, because this is an even greater unknown, is the impact of a staggered opening. So if we have certain states and certain provinces starting to open, how is that going to impact the border? And how is that going to impact companies that do business on either sides of the border? I think companies are going to be required to be incredibly nimble as they try to manage a workforce that is being given different rules in different jurisdictions. I think in the US, your companies have already been doing that, where you've got states that are not imposing a shelter in place rule. So you've got some states that are more active business-wise than others. So you're already a little bit more nimble in addressing that. But I think there's going to be the added dimension of what restrictions are being put on at the borders. This morning, they announced the reduction in times that 27 low traffic crossings were going to be open across our borders, which to me is kind of going in an opposite direction than I think people want to talk about, right? So instead of how are we opening things up, we're actually closing a little bit more. But I think these are low traffic areas. I think it's a kind of a practical response that we don't need those borders to be open as long as they were. And I think they're trying to adjust kind of in real time, as we all are. So the Prime Minister has continued to talk about limited travel, continued travel restrictions, that he is trying to work with the US and the rest of the world on how we start to adjust on these restrictions. But even tonight, we're imposing even stricter restrictions on those who are returning. And I'm sure most of you saw in your news feed this morning that travelers returning to Canada will have to have a tangible and practical self-isolation program. And if they can't, kind of produce one to the officer at the border, they will be restricted in their activities and their travel to a hotel that's been assigned to take them on. That said, we still have trucks that are crossing the border. We still have people who are working on either side of the border, at least in the short term. Last week, I know some of you may have had a chance to see the podcast that I did with Tom Clark in Global, and we talked about the 3M situation. As everything happens in this crisis, Friday, Tom and I and Elizabeth and Pam had a discussion about what we were going to talk about on Monday. As soon as we hung up the phone, the 3M thing hit the news. So the Monday discussion became slightly different again. And I think we've all learned to become a lot more nimble in our response to pretty much everything that business is throwing at us these days. Now, thankfully, the federal US government has come back with a different directive as far as the transportation of goods into Mexico and Canada that deal with the virus. And so I think we found a better place, but there's still issues that need to be resolved. We've still got the border worker issues, the healthcare workers in Windsor going over to Detroit, and how do we deal with those people as opposed to the transportation of goods, which I think is a slightly different and simpler problem. So I think, moving forward, it's going to be, one step forward, hopefully just a little baby step back as we look at how different jurisdictions are opening up back up to business, and how we can look at the border and continue to, have in place security and safety requirements that both sides, I think, are looking for and need, but also not tampering down on the opening of business as it starts to happen slowly over the next few weeks. So those are my kind of opening remarks, words of wisdom this morning or this afternoon. Dan, I think you've got some questions for me, and I'm hoping that we start to see and I see we've already got one question, so thank you for that. I hope we start to see more. So Dan, I'll flip it over to you.
Well, sure. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for that great summary, Monique. And let me just start, and I see some of the questions already are targeting the border. We've heard a lot from whether it's our governor here in Ohio, Mike DeWine, or Governor Whitmer in Michigan, or Premier Ford, or et cetera. We keep hearing the phrase light switch. This isn't going to be like a light switch, right? It's going to be more like a dimmer. I've heard Governor Newsom out in California say that. Toggle is another phrase. When we think about the border, do you see a scenario where we do flip a switch, right? That is it going to be one day that things are kind of back to the way they were? But I think the more likely scenario is probably not. I don't want to guide your answer. But if that's the case, what does the border look like a month from now? What does it look like 2 months from now, 6 months from now? I mean, do we start seeing new procedures? Is this kind of a post 9/11 period all over again? Or just from your vantage point, I've worked in the U.S. government, Canadian government around 9/11 and beyond. You did the same, I know. What do you think we can't have a Canada-U.S. conversation without the border, right? We lose our accreditation if we do that. But where do you think what we're looking at over the next couple of months here, 6 months from now, a year out?
So I think, it's not a light switch, for sure. I think there's general agreement that it's not a light switch. I think it's more like a dimmer. I think we will see, and I actually think that we will see, one step forward, half a step back. I think if anything starts to go sideways, there will be a very quick clamp down. I think we're going to see, we're going to watch closely what's happening in Southeast Asia and China, but also in Europe, and see how they start dealing with their own openings as countries, and then how they start dealing with their neighbors. Because keep in mind, I mean, you know, Italy is surrounded by a few countries, and those neighbors are cautious. And I think we're gonna see a lot of back and forth between countries as to how they're going to deal with goods, services, people. You know, I think there will be different tranches of realignment. And I think that we're going to see maybe certain areas where there's less traffic, where there's less infection, opened a little bit sooner, and to see how that works. So maybe, you know, maybe Saskatchewan is the one that goes first, and let's see how that works. You know, there's not the traffic that they have in BC or in Ontario or Quebec. So there might be a way to manage. Now, are we going to have different ways of doing things? Yeah, I think we are. I was in Myanmar in February. And so we were already in a state of, you know, precaution. I did fly through Hong Kong. I was one of the few people without a mask, following the Western education, which was the mask wasn't going to help you if you weren't spreading. So, and I felt very safe because everybody else had a mask. But I could not get through security without having my temperature taken. And I couldn't check into my hotel without having my temperature taken. And also questions asked. Have you been to Wuhan? Have you been to, you know, so there were precautions being taken both at the airport. In one instance during my travels, they actually had people like in full hazmat suit get on the plane and take our temperature all the way through before they let us even deplane. So I think we're going to get to a point where there are going to be precautions like that being taken at the border, until people are comfortable that we've beat this thing, and you know, that we have a vaccine, and that we have some kind of solution.
And I just want to invite people to, you can type in your question, or at least say, I have a question in the chat area, and I think the team from Global will unmute you or something like that, so that you can be on camera or not, is my understanding that how that will work.
Yeah, we're happy to help facilitate that, Dan. And just for folks maybe not totally familiar with Zoom, at the very bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat function. And so you just click that. And we do have one from Mark. So any idea what may be required with respect to validation of information to allow cross-border traffic? I think you guys somewhat touched on that. Will people need to validate their health status? So I know Monique was referring to temperature checks, things like that, and whether they actually need to present any form of a clear doctor's note or things like that. I think you touched on that, but I'm not sure. Mark, if you have anything to add, I'll unmute you if your question got answered, or Monique or Dan, if you have anything that you wanted to add to his specific question.
I can add a little bit more context to it. So in the context of this, you see that, you know, the virus has kind of an incubation period where you may not exhibit symptoms, but you're still contagious. And so is there going to be something where prior to travel for 2 weeks, you need to start tracking certain amount of temperature, health status, things of that nature? It really, in effect, puts the onus on the individual to validate that they're healthy to be able to enter the country. And that's why I'm wondering whether that is going to be kind of what's mandatory. I understand the temperature check and all of those aspects associated with spot checking at that one specific time. I'm just wondering whether there's a lead time more now involved potentially. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we might start to see that. I mean, on the temporary foreign workers, they're looking at self-isolation for 14 days as they arrive into the country. And so I think as we try to see the border opening a bit more, they might try to ask for more information about your kind of prior activities before you travel. I think what we're going to bump up against in so many of these restrictions or precautions is privacy concerns. I mean, you know, when I had my temperature checked at the airport, they didn't they didn't look at my boarding pass and check my temperature. It was just a temperature check. So it was just like random. And if you tested high, they bumped you out of line. So it wasn't like that information wasn't attached to my name at that point. But I think as we move across borders in the future, it's tough to say because there will be privacy concerns. And do you start to give people a certain status like trusted traveler, like Nexus? Like, if you test, they're talking about this testing with the antibodies, and that even if you haven't had the virus, if you've got the antibodies, then that shows that you can't get the virus. I mean, if that technology gets to a certain point and you can be tested to say that you can't have the antibodies, can that be added to your trusted traveler documents so that you can kind of easily pass back and forth? We may get to that place. But again, privacy experts will have concerns about what kind of information is being shared with various authorities on either sides of the border.
Do you think our Western culture can get a handle on that privacy balance now? Eastern cultures seem to be better at understanding that, and they have their own challenges there. I think there was something in China where there was a cell phone app that allows you to travel, and it went from green to yellow for a whole series of people, which limited travel and their ability to move around. But do you think our Western-based culture will be able to find a good balance on that privacy versus proper diligence?
Yeah, it's hard to know because, I mean, we're in a new normal, right? Like people have now, had to stay at home for weeks and maybe months, and maybe our tolerance for a little more intrusion in our lives to ensure the safety of everyone will grow. But even the Apple Google partnership that they're talking about, where they'd have this app that you could voluntarily put on your phone that would show that if someone around you that you've been in contact with tests positive, you will get a notification so that you can then get tested. I don't know if I want the world to know or various authorities to know who I'm hanging out with at any given time. Trust me, my life is not that exciting right now. My little house up north, there is a lot going on. But I think, to answer your question, will the West get there? I think we need to get ourselves there.
Thank you very much.
Dan, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Well, no, not so much to add to that, but I think it also kind of links Mark's question with a question that's pending too from Rod, which essentially is asking, do you think there's advantages to Canada trying to coordinate opening with the border to the U.S.? And if I can maybe tee that up in trying to tap into your perspective as somebody that worked on behalf of a province in the States. I actually took the closing of the border, how we did it, to be an example of how Canada-U.S. can work very well. I think the Canadians smartly approached the U.S. first and said, we know this is coming, let's do this together. And we had almost 20 years of homework since 9/11, where there were a lot of people, as you know, at Homeland Security and Public Safety and all the alphabet soup that know each other, and that we did that constructively. I think where we missed the mark at first, and it kind of fell into the usual trap of Canada-U.S., was the 3M situation, where I don't think anybody really thought that was going to be an issue. We have these integrated supply chains. Then the U.S. went off and did something on its own. Canada got whipsawed. And then, like I told people when they would call, this is going to die out in a few days. It always does in Canada, U.S., but it's going to be bloody until we get there. And unfortunately, I think literally in some cases. But we got that fixed. Is there an opportunity right now? We know business recovery and resumption is going to be disjointed. Do you think that Canada and the United States are working right now, or provinces talking? We're starting to see governors work regional alignments in the Northeast and West. But do you think that that's already happening? Or if not, how can we accelerate that? Or do we need to go it alone first and stitch it back together? I mean, there's all kinds of, our usual approach is usually we do it separate in Canada, US, and then stitch it together very quickly. But but what do you think's happening right in terms of those kind of planning right now?
I think there's probably more coordination. We see it down the line, right? We know that at some point borders are going to open again, and we need to make sure that both sides are ready. I think that, you know, with the closing of the border, we saw some consultation, and yes, 3M, you know, but in retrospect, 3M, I think, is going to be seen as a bit of a blip that forced everybody to kind of come together and realign. It took 5 days to get the directive from the government to kind of realign. That's a little, like, I understand in business terms, that's a long time, especially in you know, when we're trying to get necessary health supplies across the border. And, you know, I don't think in a pandemic situation, I don't think any response is going to be perfect. There's going to be toing and froing. But I think, and I touched on this last week in my little podcast, the relationships that developed over time, and particularly through the negotiations of NAFTA 2, between governors and premiers, and between like the next level down, because in politics people change, players change, but between the civil servants, I think will stand us in good stead. There's also organizations that exist on both coasts and in the middle, between border states and provinces. So the East Coast premiers and governors meet once a year. The Great Lakes governors and premiers meet every 2 years, like in full force, and every year as kind of a consultation. And then there's PENWAR on the West Coast, which is Western governors and premiers. All of those organizations, you know, knit together a bit of a foundation for discussions to happen and for people to reach out to each other. So I can only assume that Premier Ford is in discussions with the governor of Ohio, with the governor of Illinois, with the governor of Michigan in particular, and if he's not too busy, the governor of New York. There's you know, there is a basis for those discussions to happen, and for some of those issues to be discussed, not to set out ways of doing things, because really it is the federal government that manages the borders, but to influence how those ways of doing things are coming about by having the governors talking to the president, the premiers talking to the prime minister, and hopefully coming together with something that works on both sides.
And I again continue to invite people to submit comments. But in that vein, do you think that you talked about the relationships that build, particularly in these moments, right? There's these moments, we saw chaos after 9/11. There was that coming together originally, but people kind of forget. We focus on Broadway musicals on the first few days, but the first few months and years after that were not good for Canada-US. Generally, we had different views in Iraq, but then we came together and we did the border. But Canada-US kind of has that tidal nature. We kind of come in and out every day, but we have these high water marks where in times of crisis, usually economic crisis or security crisis, then we really come up with some really good ideas. And folks have been working together on USMCA and others. But do you think this is an opportunity where, you know, as we get through this urgency and maybe a couple months down the road or 6 months down the road, that governors and premiers will say, look, we need to really start working together, not just on PPE, but something I know near and dear to your heart, you know, Buy America type issues or Buy State X. You know, is there an opportunity here, or maybe how do we get our workforce across the border? These things that kind of get stuck because of benign neglect, but do you think that'll be an opportunity in the wake of this where Canada-US can actually kind of surge ahead, where we sometimes get stuck in the mud?
Well, I think arguably 9/11 did create that impetus for you know, some improvements on border crossings, and, you know, created Beyond Borders, created the border discussions that happened every year. I think it ebbs and flows, as you said. I think there was more activity for a while because, you know, the pullback and the stringent requirements, and then people wanted to see that improve, and so looking at technology, how do we improve? And then, you know, we get back into, well, we're kind of best friends and cousins, and, you know, it all gets sorted out in the wash. But I think now we're back to a situation where we're in crisis, and coming out of the crisis, I think there may be opportunity to look at the border situation again, and to start to look at how, you know, what new technology can we adopt to, as we used to say, thin the borders as opposed to thicken the borders, so that business, you know, can happen in a more seamless way. There is, you know, there is technology. There are ways to make the transportation of goods a lot easier. Some of it costs money, and but you know, as we look forward to getting out of this mess and how we put the economy back on track, maybe those are the kinds of government investments that have to be made so that the international piece of trade can come back as quickly as possible. I see we've spurred a couple of more questions, so that's good. Someone's asking about the long-term impacts on the supply chain, which actually feeds into my answer just now. So I think you know, in a crisis comes opportunity. And so maybe not for this week, not for next, maybe not this fall, but maybe in 2021, 2022, we start to look at how do we improve the transportation of goods, the crossing of the border, and how do we implement new technology and even newer technology, because, you know, in a crisis comes invention. And so I think there are, you know, there are people madly working away to improve detection technology. And so how can we adopt that at the border in the future to streamline and to improve crossings and hopefully help trade in the longer term? I'm just looking over. Elizabeth, do you want to take us to Rashawn's question?
Yeah, and Rashawn, I'll unmute you, and maybe you can add some additional commentary to it. Oh, it won't unmute you, but it was basically, and everyone can read it too, but basically wondering if some Canadian commentators here said that we have the advantage of the Queen compared to the US. Would her involvement help to solve trade issues? So I guess whether the, oh, and where did you go, Rashawn? There you are, unmuted. So did you have anything else to add to your question?
No, it just came to my mind when I was listening to the Queen, and then at some stage they showed British soldiers putting some boxes to the warehouse, and all those boxes had the 3M logo. That's when it occurred to me, and then I listened to the commentators. I said, maybe she can have a role to play and help on the trade. I don't know how Canada uses her. Would that be an advantage? I know nothing of that. But I just saw the boxes with the 3M. If she's not taking ads from 3M, I say, why would you put the 3M boxes behind the Queen? So I thought maybe it had never occurred to me, to be honest.
So I would suggest that the British probably had no idea that we were having a 3M crisis on this side of the pond, given that they've got kind of a whole lot of other problems on their plate over there. I would say that the Queen has been like unbelievable for 91 or 92 as a kind of pillar of strength for the country. And I thought it was amazing that she stepped in with her Easter greetings, you know, given that the Prime Minister was down for the count for a bit, and just showed leadership for the country. But as far as assisting in trade negotiations, that's not part of her, that's not in her bailiwick, as they would say in Britain. And also, I think the 3M that we saw there was probably the 3M produced in Britain, or at a minimum in Europe. So probably nothing to do with our 3M issues. But thank you for the question. There's another one on the relevant government, have the relevant governments turn their attention to measures to restore confidence while economic conditions loosen. What if the border starts to open and no one wants to venture forth? Thanks, Bill. I think there will always be a need to venture forth. I mean, the U.S. is the largest market for largest export market for Canadian businesses, and you know, there are 37 million people in Canada. There are 330 in the U.S. That's a large market right at our doorstep, and I don't think that will ever change, and I think it will always be an enticement for countries who want to grow, because it is the easiest market to access. So I think there will continue to be demand for improvements at the border, regardless of when we're coming out of this. And I think we'll see, we may see more small businesses looking to do more business across the border as they try to recover, and that might actually increase the demand for better border crossing mechanisms. Dan, did you have something to add to that one?
No, I do think it's a great question, though. Once we start, how long is it going to take to roll for the economy to catch up once the restrictions are lifted, and slow roll? Are people going to be comfortable getting on airplanes? Are people going to be wanting to go cross border in the same way to get those volumes back up? And I think that's a very real question. Particularly now, I feel bad for the guys that make ties and suits, because I think a lot of us are realizing we don't need those anymore. So, so that may be but we may see, but I'm a big believer in that we'll see growth in other areas as well. People will see new opportunities. And I think particularly one of the issues we can talk about toward the end is when we start bringing a lot of this production back from overseas, which I think will be a consequence of this. Where are those market opportunities going to be? But I know Rod has a few questions. Rick, there's a bunch of others coming in. So I'll turn that over to you, Elizabeth. I don't know how you want to manage, if we want to unmute people or what here.
I just want to add that there has been a growth in sweat gear and yoga pants. That was reported this morning. So yes, in fact, Dan, your prediction, I think, is coming true right before our eyes.
No kidding. Okay, so building off one of your previous answers, when do you think stimulus spending on either physical or technology infrastructure, will take place? 6 months versus 18 months? Will it be accelerated? How quickly can we see some money going out the door? So I don't know if you guys want to touch on that quickly. And then there's a question around the presidential election coming up quickly in November. So maybe I'll let you touch on the first one, and then we'll skip to that. And just wanted to note for folks, we have about 15 minutes left. So if you do have any other questions, please feel free to type them in.
Okay, and I'm just going to jump to the one that just popped up, insight into the government programs on both sides of the border. And I'm just going to put a little plug in for Global. Global provides updates daily on what the government is doing federally and in every part of the country. So there's a BC update, there's an Alberta update, there's Quebec updates, there's Ontario updates. So I know that there are resources available. If we don't get to that question about specific programs, there are lots of ways to access the information to those programs, and I'll let Elizabeth wind up with that at the end. To answer the question on infrastructure, I think that is an interesting question. I'm always happy to talk about infrastructure. It's one of my things, and I did a lot of work when I was in Washington promoting the Ontario model of public-private partnerships to build public infrastructure. The challenge with infrastructure is to have shovel-ready projects. So the governments are going to want to put together projects that are ready to go, because they want to have shovels in the ground and have a financial impact in communities. So, whether that's going to take 6 months or 18 months, I think will have a lot to do with what governments are able to plan, how governments are able to plan in this period of time. So, you've got a full-on government-wide initiative on how to deal with the pandemic. But our both federal and provincial, state and federal governments, assigning folks to be looking at down the road, if we're going to do infrastructure spending, what are the projects we're going to look at? How are we going to determine what's shovel ready, and how fast can we get those shovels in the ground and the money out the door? I would argue that we're going to see it in the short term, because that has been seen in the past to be a fiscal, fuel. And people have seen in 2000, certainly in the 2008 financial crisis, in Ontario, at least, we put a lot of money into infrastructure, and it certainly helped us ride the storm. And I think one of the reasons we were successful was our ability to determine which projects were shovel ready and how fast we could get people back to work, shovels in the ground, stuff moving. So I would say that the jurisdictions that are kind of wisest will be looking at what projects they can get going and starting to plan for that. We've also heard in the US, the president talk about infrastructure, and there has been a start of discussion about infrastructure, but I would warn that in the US, since President Trump arrived, there's been this pent up, and I think, Dan, you know what I'm talking about, this pent up anticipation for the big infrastructure plan that was going to come out, and we were all going to see tons of work and tons of new projects. And it's been almost 4 years and we haven't seen that really happen. So, you know, I leave it at that. Dan, did you have anything to add on the infrastructure thing, or should we move on to the presidential election?
I would just agree wholeheartedly, and it ties into Rick Roth's question on the presidential election. I think, you know, it's infrastructure week. It's been infrastructure week about 47 times in the last year. Now, on the good news is AmCham Canada actually was supposed to be hosting, in part with the National Governors Association, a delegation of governors to come to Ontario next week. And it just shows that there is that interest at the state level, because our states are out of cash in a lot of cases and are looking for innovative models, and they need to repair infrastructure. And so there's a lot of work around smart cities and smart infrastructure, and Ontario and other parts of Canada are leaders on that. So I just don't think we will see that in the US before the 2020 elections. I just don't think anybody's going to give on that until we see how November plays out. Unless there's just a complete bottoming out, and I can't even imagine what that would look like of the economy. But I'll turn it over back to the other questions as well. Now that doesn't mean, and let me just say that I think that gets to the question. I think we'll probably see another stimulus in the U.S., but it'll be more targeted toward individuals. I don't think we will see a phase 4, as it would be known for Corona, that would include a major infrastructure bill. I think people have their hearts set on that, but I think it's going to be more about direct funding to banks to deal with the PPP programs like the Canada, which is the U.S. version of the CEWS that Global reports on, and others. So I think it's going to be more people driven than infrastructure driven until after November.
All right. Can you hear me? Because my screen just went blank.
Oh, yeah. No, we can hear
okay,
you, Dominic.
Good.
And maybe we can just, or I'll let you finish, but feed into the presidential election question, and maybe just give some general comments around it. The specific question was just around, you know, will it hamper an economic recovery, and how do we think that the free trade and the cross-border cooperation will be cast in this election cycle that we're in.
Well, I think I think, you know, it is the looming kind of elephant, you know, at the end of the road. I mean, November is not that far off. And, you know, as we start to look at still being isolating in place, you know, through May into June, and we see places like Louisiana putting off their primary until July. You know, I think this is going to be a whole new world for presidential elections. You know, you see Biden trying to get some attention. He's got, you know, the former president's endorsement yesterday. He's got Elizabeth Warren's endorsement today. They're going to have to do a lot to keep him in the spotlight, and to try and kind of counter all of the other programming in the news, which is all pandemic all the time. And certainly the president is giving himself a platform every single day to get out there and get his message out. And, you know, whether or not that's to do with the pandemic or his campaign, some days remains to be seen. how is NAFTA or USMCA going to impact the election? I think, you know, we did see it pass through Congress. So I think that, you know, that's a good sign. I don't think that there's going to be any backtracking. I think, you know, many people who've been involved in the negotiations over time saw the final version that was passed to be, you know, somewhat watered down. But given the time constraints, given the, you know, the speed with which it was kind of negotiated, I know not everybody thinks it's speedy, but in trade negotiation world, I'm told that was incredibly speedy. I think that it's kind of, it's an agreement that both sides can live with, and I don't know that it's necessarily going to be, you know, bandied about in the election as an issue. I think by the time we get to the fall, people are going to be so focused on recovery and anything and everything that helps the economy, I think is going to be considered a good thing. And I think the tolerance for attacking the deal will be low. Can someone repeat to me the question just so that I can make sure that I did answer it, because I can't read it on my screen right now?
Yeah, of course. I believe you did answer it. So I wonder if you believe the presidential election will hamper an economic recovery in slowing the political will in both houses, and how you think free trade and Canada-US cooperation will be cast in an election cycle. So yeah, Dan, I don't know if Dan has any, or if you have additional comments, Monique, and if Dan has anything to add.
No, Dan, did you want to add anything?
The only thing I'd say about the election, I think it will be good for Canada-US because the president's going to say Vice President Biden voted for NAFTA the first time and he fixed it. And then the Democrats are going to say, yeah, but we fixed your USMCA. So I think it'll be kind of a wash to see who loves USMCA the most at this point, which is probably good for Canada-US. But I think on trade, generally, this is going to be the China election. It's going to be all about, because Joe Biden has made some comments out of context that make him look soft on China, and that's just not where the political sentiment is in the U.S. right now. So I think it's going to be a big fight about who's tougher on China, which I think the only concern I have for Canada-U.S. is sometimes when the U.S. does things directed at China, that sea, the Canadian sea, gets hit as well. So we always have to make sure that we're looking for that Canadian exemption, like we saw with 3M and PPE. So it's just something to keep an eye on. But and I think there's a final question here. I don't know if you can see it, Monique, but it's about, we're talking a lot about trade, but what about tourism between the two countries? When can that start? I know when you were in Washington, that's a big part of the Canada-U.S. relationship. And what do you think about the tourism impacts here? And are they going to be covered in some of these packages as well?
Yeah, just to go back to the trade question for 1 second, then I'll deal with tourism. On the trade, I think those, you know, those folks who are really engaged on Canada-U.S. trade are going to be listening long and hard to hear anything talked about on Canada-U.S. trade. I agree in the campaign. I think it's going to be a fairly low profile issue. And I do agree that, you know, clearly the president is lining up China to be a big issue in this campaign. And as we have seen, particularly with our two, you know, prisoners still in prison in China, Canada is often collateral damage in that battle. And I think we will have to certainly be vigilant in monitoring the dialogue, the chatter around that and how it's going to impact Canada. On tourism, yes, I was the Minister of Tourism for Ontario, so I have a particular soft spot for that industry and how it's being impacted, which is incredibly. I note that the tourism industry of Ontario and the Economic Development Councils of Ontario and the Ontario Business Improvement Areas yesterday put out a joint letter looking to the government for commercial rent relief, for interest relief on debt, and for financial aid, not debt deferral. So they have certainly made their case for being hardest hit. I think that tourism worldwide is going to take a long time to recover. No doubt, you know, travel will start again at some point. Probably the business travelers before the tourist travelers. I think there are certain parts of the tourism industry, like cruise ships that will be very hard hit. But I think that people will probably, you know, this summer into the fall will, I mean, if we're not forced to, we'll be staying closer to home, only because, you know, they're wary and there's a lot of unknown out there. So I think the tourism industry will be seeking special assistance as, you know, as the artists have and were addressed today by the Prime Minister in Canada, as the oil sector has and is waiting to be addressed by the Prime Minister. I think you're going to see the tourism sector coming forward as well, and looking for assistance in surviving this downslide, and then also assistance in promotion on the upswing in trying to get people moving again, and either, you know, staycations for Canadians if they're not feeling terribly adventurous, and how do we ensure that our small businesses, which are the backbone of tourism, are helped back to recovery through this.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm just conscious of the time. We've answered all the questions that have been in the chat. Just wanted to give you an opportunity each to give maybe a couple closing comments if you have any, and then I'll turn it over to Dave just to complete the session.
Sure. So I'm delighted to have this conversation, happy to be able to respond to your questions. I appreciate the thoughtful questions that we received. I am, you know, happy to once again be associated with AmCham ever so briefly. And I know that Global, you know, is doing a lot of work for a lot of businesses across Canada, helping them to understand what aid is available, helping them to understand how to access that aid, or if they have not been covered in whatever programs the federal and provincial governments are proposing or are implementing. Certainly the Global team is there to help industry make sure that their case is heard in those federal and provincial arenas. So know that if we can be of help, we're happy to. And I appreciate the time and the partnership with AmCham today, and a chance to chat again with Dan. So Dan, over to you.
Oh, I can't say it any better. I other than to say, so it's not just Global Public Affairs. We use Global Public Affairs information in terms of following what's going on legislatively. They've done a phenomenal job on these programs. And, you know, we at Dickinson Wright are working with companies once the programs are out to get implemented. I know PNC is doing the same thing, but having that finger on the pulse on what may be coming next, they're just a great partner to have. And we're privileged to have them at AmCham. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dave Olson.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Monique, and thanks, Dan, as well for taking some time with us today, and also thanks to all the folks who dialed in today. We referenced it, I think both of them talked about it, but please look out for those resources that are out there. There is so much happening right now. There are so many programs. Obviously, the Global Public Affairs site has great resources. We've got those resources, as Dan referenced, you know, PNC's got those as well. And then finally, you know, AmCham, we're here to help. Reach out to me, reach out to any of our board members. We'll make sure that we get you to the right place. And one thing we didn't really touch on those resources is that both the US and Canada have opened these programs up generally to companies regardless of ownership. So if you're a Canadian company and you've got operations in the US, you generally would qualify for a lot of those programs and vice versa. So I would definitely encourage you to look into to what's happening on both sides of the border. Again, we're here to help, and thanks for taking the time with us today. Take care.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody. And we'll send out, we can send out some of those resources to this group as a follow-up if folks like, so watch for that in your inbox.
Stay safe, everybody.
Stay safe. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.